Hey everyone, welcome back to Miniature Painting 101, a series of videos where I teach you how to paint miniatures from start to finish and everything in between. This is part 25, white as a primary color for a miniature. The next one will also be on white, but it will be doing white over a dark color. So, basically white is one of the hardest colors to paint miniatures with. It is a very hard color to paint and to master. The reasons include, number one, white is such a light color. It's the lightest color ever, so it's very one-dimensional. It's very boring when you just use white on a surface. Number two, it's very absorbent. It absorbs the colors around it, so you have to be very careful not to put too much shading on it or the colors around it. Or number three, it really shows brush strokes and has a chalky appearance. All these things are kind of annoying when painting white on a miniature. And so there are ways to fix this. First of all, a simple way is to prime your model very lightly when painting a primary color is white. So the best color to use as a primer is white itself. At worst, a light gray, nothing lighter than that. And second, thin your paints down and use multiple thin layers of white and of the shading, and this will produce a great effect. So as you can see here, we have a white Space Marine primed white using the Stynylrez white primer. That's a great start. So now it's white, but as you can see, it's really boring. So what we're going to use is just two colors in this demonstration. We're going to use white scars and non-oil. We're going to use non-oil to shade the miniature, and then white scars to highlight it back to a really nice white. So the non-oil will kind of tint it down to a light gray, and white scars will bring it back to white. Now if you're going over a darker surface, you can use an intermediate color such as a Ministratum gray before proceeding to the white scars. This will be shown in a future video, but for this video I will just be using non-oil and white scars. Now the key is to both of them, as I mentioned, is to thin them down. So now it's time to apply a shading. We've already base colored our miniature because it's primed white. So I take my non-oil, I add it into my palette, and what I'm going to do is thin it down very heavily. 1 part non-oil to 3 parts water, perhaps even more. The more you thin it down, so this is just normal water, the more you thin it down, the less of an effect it will have over the white, because whatever shade you add to it, the white will absorb that color and it will tint the entire miniature. You really just want to add some little bit of shading to the recesses and then to bring it back to the white. So this is basically to show you how, if you're painting a model such as a white scars model. So what we're going to do is take our very, very watered down non-oil and just apply it very, very lightly to the miniature. And as you can see here, we're just pulling the color and the shade where we want it. Get it into those cracks, the crevices, and the recesses, and the edges, but leave the rest of the miniature as light as possible, because the more you tint it, the harder it is to bring it back to white, and that means the more coats of thin down white you're going to need to do. And for this goal, our goal is just to add the shading and then bring it back with maybe 2 light thin down coats of white scars. So as you can see here, just adding it very nicely and evenly into the crevices. And as you can see now, look at that, all the definition is starting to reappear on the miniature. As I said, white is a very boring color. It's the brightest, and therefore it's just really boring whenever you're painting it. So essentially the key is you got to produce almost like a dirty white, as I call it. You'll notice that some of the really good white painters, it's not just white, it has a slight tinge of dirt to it, or grayness to the recesses, and that's what you're going for with white. That way it has character and dimension. And the same problem applies with black, but we'll go over black in a future video. So as you can see now, just bringing it nicely, bringing the watered down non-oil gently into the crevices and recesses. Now I'm going to cover the entire miniature. If you wanted to just stay on the safe side, you can use it as more of a shade, but I'm just going to bring it over into the entire miniature. That way I can show you how to highlight over it. As you can see, because it is watered down, be very careful because it will drip all over the place, and it's going to be very easy to move around. As you can see, it'll tend to pool around certain areas, such as the bottom of that arrow, which you can see now, And using your brush, you can easily just re-guide it and reposition it, the shading. Which you'll see I will be doing, just making sure it goes to where I want it. As you can see there, I just re-guided it. Now I prevent it from pulling up in that certain area. And I'm just giving all of this areas some nice depth and feel to them, but I'm not tinting it. The goal is to not tint the white too badly. When it dries, remember, shades will always dry darker than when you put them over it. So right now, even though I've watered down heavily, as you can see now, once it's dry, it's still a bit of a dark tint to it, and it appears almost light gray, but it's still very close to white. So now our goal is to bring it back to white and highlight it back up with a couple thin down layers of white scars, which number one will prevent the appearance of brush strokes and also pretty much remove some of the chalkiness from the look of the model. So we're going to take our white scars, which is a thin down paint to begin with. It's part of the layers group from the Citadel range, so it's not a very thick paint. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to water it down to almost the milk consistency you use for an airbrush, but not quite there. But as you can see, I'm going to water it down quite significantly and dilute it pretty significantly. And the reason for that is, as I said, you don't want to show brush strokes, and you don't want to do too extreme of a highlight. You want to do a nice transition from the gray and the recesses and crevices to the real white that you're trying to achieve. So here I am mixing it quite nicely, and as you see, it's a pretty thin down consistency now. As I'm showing it on the palette, it's going to be pretty thin. And now I'm just going to quite slowly, not quickly at all, quite gently and precisely apply it to the areas I want to brighten up. So I'm going to leave that gray along the edges, the recesses, the crevices, and I'm going to highlight up the whites. And I'm also looking at where my light source is hitting right now, and I'm going to focus on areas that the light is hitting in the second round of highlights. But all I'm doing is using white scars twice, and you'll see that I'm just building the color right back up to that nice bright white while giving it some definition. Especially on the helmet. The helmet is one of those parts where it's kind of a little tricky. As I said, you want to leave the shading along all the edges and just build up the whites around the edges, around the center parts of the helmet, and just make it brighter as you go more inward. And this is important around the parts of the eyebrows and around the mouth of the helmet. As you see around the feet, just highlighting the toes and the edges parts already makes it really pop, because now we can clearly see the recesses and edges, but now the white is being built up. And then when building up around the legs, feel free to not paint as much white on the inside of the legs, since they would be shaded anyway by the natural appearance and stance of the model. Here I'm just building that white back up, and as you see, it's starting to clean up the model really well, but you can still see the edges, and that's what we're going for. So there I go around the hands, just carefully leaving a little bit of gray in the recesses, and we're going to put an overbrush on the fingers, keeping those details. So this part is actually quite slow. To paint white well, you need patience and precision, and to take your time, because you gotta slowly build those colors right back up, and it just takes a little bit of time. It's not one of the colors you can really splash on a miniature and have a quick effect. So you see I'm re-highlighting it right back up to a nice white. And with the backpack, I'm going to leave some parts of the model the tinted gray, and those would be areas where naturally, if this model was white scars, for example, the edges of the armor would be painted a different color, and so would the symbols be on the back, so I'm going to just leave them there. And after a single coat, here's what he looks like. He looks pretty nice, but what we're going to do is we're going to take one more coat and just re-highlight, this time even further away from the recesses, and what this is going to do is it's just going to build up another layer of white to accomplish the bright white that you want, and has a nice gradient between the shading and the bright white. And you can keep repeating this process. The way amazing painters will do 3 or 4 coats of this, I'm just doing 2 very simple coats of this and showing how effective it can be. So once again, I'm going to focus more inwards and just go towards the more center areas of this model, and also look at what areas the light source is hitting. So I'm going to focus more on the tops of the knees and not paint the bottom of the knees with this second coat, and I'm not going to paint the inside of the legs. As you can see here, after another coat, and another key part, which I should have mentioned earlier, is that once you start painting a surface with this white, let it completely dry before touching any of the paint again. White is really bad for showing cracks in the paint or brush strokes, as I mentioned earlier. So once you start painting a surface, paint it completely and then move on to the next one, and don't go back to that other one until it's completely dry. You don't want to crack the paint. As you can see now, there's some good recesses. The gray tint is still left on the arrow, but the arrow would normally be a different color on the miniature anyway, so I'm not going to paint that white. Another thing is, if you're painting the model primarily white and you want to paint areas like the gun, I'd recommend painting them black first. As I mentioned, the metallics, you really want to go over black color, so paint them black and then paint the metallics over the black, and it's much easier. It's always easier to paint a dark color over a light color than a light color over a dark color. Remember that for future videos. And once again, I'm just building up another highlight, going to the edges and the areas of the model that my light source is hitting, and just going away from the recesses. And there you go. And now, after 2 quick, easy coats, we have built up that white again, and that's it, essentially the key to painting white. So prime a very light color, water down your shading very much, get in those recesses, and then build it back up with thin down layers of white. And then you get the nice bright white again, but you also get the detail. And in the end, you get this kind of, as I call it, dirty white appearance, where it's obviously white, but there's some great definition to it. And that is ultimately what we're trying to accomplish here. And that's it. So thank you so much for watching this episode of Miniature Painting 101. And as I mentioned in the title, stay tuned for next week's episode, part 26, where I'll be showing you how to paint white over a dark color. And if you can't wait, check out The Warp, my premium YouTube channel, where not only will you get to see the next 5 months of Miniature Painting 101 episodes, we also get to see more battle reports, start to finish painting tutorials, and just some awesome wargaming content. So thank you so much for watching. Until next time, this is Jay saying, happy painting, everyone.